August 29, 1949. Semipalatinsk Test Site, Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. At 0700 hours local time, United States Air Force atmospheric sampling flights operating over the Pacific detected abnormal radioactive isotopes consistent with plutonium fission. Within hours, additional analysis confirmed the unmistakable signature of a nuclear detonation. Seismic data later supported the assessment. United States intelligence estimates issued just 18 months earlier projected a Soviet atomic bomb no earlier than 1952. The discrepancy was not theoretical. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 130,000 Americans worked on the Manhattan Project. Security doctrine focused on physicists, equations, and laboratory secrecy. Industrial radiochemistry was treated as routine support work. One American Army engineer was assigned to inspect those facilities. His reports were precise. They never went to Washington, they went to Moscow. In June of 1942, the United States War Department authorized the Manhattan Engineer District under the command of the Army Corps of Engineers. The initial budget allocation reached $2.2 billion, equivalent to approximately $30 billion in contemporary purchasing power. Workforce projections anticipated more than 130,000 personnel distributed across Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and subsidiary facilities throughout the American interior. The Manhattan Project represented the largest scientific and industrial undertaking in American history to that point. Entire cities were constructed in remote locations. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, grew from a population of 3,000 to 75,000 within 18 months. Hanford, Washington expanded from agricultural land to a sprawling industrial complex processing plutonium at scales never before attempted. Los Alamos, New Mexico, became home to some of the most brilliant scientific minds in the world, working under conditions of absolute secrecy. Strategic doctrine within the Joint Chiefs of Staff assumed exclusive United States nuclear capability for a minimum of 5 years following operational deployment. Some classified assessments extended that timeline to 10 years. The Soviet atomic program was assessed as fragmented, under-resourced, and technologically underdeveloped. American planners calculated that Soviet scientists lacked access to sufficient uranium ore, industrial-scale enrichment capacity, and the theoretical foundation necessary for implosion-type weapon design. Intelligence assessments compiled by the Office of Strategic Services painted a picture of Soviet scientific isolation. German occupation had disrupted Soviet research institutions. Industrial capacity was devoted entirely to conventional war production. The cyclotron facility at the Radium Institute in Leningrad had been evacuated. Key scientists were dispersed across the Soviet interior. American analysts concluded that even under optimal conditions, Soviet nuclear development would require years of concentrated effort, beginning only after the conclusion of the war in Europe. This assessment shaped American post-war planning at the highest levels. Nuclear monopoly was embedded into strategic bomber deployment schedules, occupation policy in Germany and Japan, diplomatic negotiations over Eastern European political alignment, and early discussions of international atomic energy control under United Nations auspices. Security emphasis was placed almost entirely on Los Alamos and theoretical research. The assumption was simple: protect the equations and you protect the bomb. But the equations were not the bottleneck. Public belief in absolute secrecy contrasted sharply with classified underestimation of industrial exposure. While physicists worked under heavy compartmentalization, the industrial facilities that processed uranium, refined plutonium, and manufactured weapon components operated under comparatively loose oversight. Chemical engineers, radiochemists, and technical officers moved between sites, inspected processes, and documented efficiency issues with minimal counterintelligence scrutiny. The logic was institutional. Scientists possessed knowledge that, if transmitted to a hostile power, could accelerate theoretical understanding. Engineers possessed only operational familiarity with isolated production tasks. Counterintelligence resources were allocated accordingly. FBI background investigations focused on political affiliations, criminal records, and potential sympathies with Axis powers. The primary concern in 1943 was Nazi sabotage, not Soviet penetration. The atomic monopoly was calculated in conference rooms and strategic planning documents. It was never verified on the factory floor. By mid-1943, the United States had committed unprecedented resources to a single weapons program. The scale was industrial, the security assumptions were academic, and the vulnerabilities were structural. One of those vulnerabilities had already been activated. And its activation had occurred not through theoretical brilliance or scientific espionage at the highest levels, but through patient, methodical collection of manufacturing data by a man who understood that processes mattered more than equations. United States birth records list George Abramovich Koval, born December 25, 1913, in Sioux City, Iowa. His parents were Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire who had settled in the American Midwest during the early waves of Eastern European migration that brought millions to the United States between 1880 and 1920. George grew up speaking both English and Russian, attended local schools, and by all official accounts was an ordinary American child navigating the experience of second-generation immigrant life. Sioux City in the 1920s was a regional agricultural and meatpacking center with a population approaching 70,000. The Koval family lived among a small but established Jewish community, part of the broader fabric of ethnic European settlement that defined much of the American Midwest during this period. George attended public schools, participated in community activities, and gave no outward indication of the trajectory his life would later follow. But in the early 1930s, during the height of the Great Depression, the Koval family made an unusual decision. They emigrated to the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of Americans and Europeans traveled to the Soviet Union during this period, drawn by promises of employment, ideological commitment, or simply economic survival. The Soviet Union advertised technical positions, industrial opportunities, and the promise of a society free from the unemployment and economic collapse devastating the capitalist world. Many immigrants were skilled workers, engineers, and craftsmen whose expertise was welcomed in Soviet industrial expansion programs. Most returned disillusioned within a few years, confronted by the reality of Stalinist repression, chronic shortages, and political purges that made daily life precarious and dangerous. The Kovals did not return. George enrolled at the Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow, one of the premier scientific institutions in the Soviet Union. Established in 1880, the Mendeleev Institute trained generations of Soviet chemists and chemical engineers in fields ranging from petroleum refining to pharmaceutical production. George's focus was radiochemistry and isotope handling, fields with both civilian and military applications that were experiencing rapid development in the 1930s as nuclear physics transitioned from theoretical curiosity to practical experimentation. Soviet records released after the dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics confirm that during this period, George Koval was recruited by the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the Soviet military. The GRU operated parallel to the more publicly recognized NKVD, focusing on military and technical intelligence rather than political counterintelligence and internal security. GRU recruitment emphasized technical specialists who could operate abroad, collect intelligence on foreign military and industrial capabilities, and transmit data that would support Soviet technological development. He was assigned the codename Delamar. The training was methodical and targeted. Koval was not instructed to memorize theoretical physics or reproduce classified equations from academic journals. He was trained to understand industrial processes, how materials move through production pipelines, how tolerances were measured, how efficiency bottlenecks were identified and corrected, how quality control was maintained in high-stakes manufacturing environments. The GRU did not need another physicist capable of discussing quantum mechanics or nuclear fission cross-sections. They needed someone who could walk into a factory, observe operations without raising suspicion, and understand what mattered from an engineering standpoint. American citizenship versus Soviet intelligence preparation. On paper, George Koval was a loyal son of Iowa, a young man with an American birth certificate and a Midwestern upbringing who had followed his family to the Soviet Union during economic hardship. In practice, he was a technical intelligence officer with a specific operational mandate, trained in one of the most demanding technical intelligence disciplines and prepared for long-term deployment in a target environment. He was trained to understand processes, not secrets. And in 1943, the United States Army gave him a uniform, security clearance, and access to the most sensitive industrial facilities in the Manhattan Project. In February of 1943, the United States expanded its military draft to include technical personnel with backgrounds in chemistry, physics, engineering, and related sciences. The Manhattan Project required thousands of trained specialists to operate industrial-scale enrichment plants, radiochemical processing facilities, and weapons assembly sites. Civilian scientists and engineers possessed the expertise, but they lacked the disciplinary structure, security framework, and legal authority that military service provided. The solution was the Special Engineer Detachment, a program that inducted civilian scientists and engineers into the Army and assigned them to classified facilities under military command. The Special Engineer Detachment was unique in American military history. Recruits were not trained for combat. They were trained for technical supervision. Many possessed advanced degrees from American universities. Some had worked in private industry as chemical engineers, metallurgists, or research scientists. Others were recent graduates recruited directly from university programs with expertise in fields relevant to atomic weapon development. Background checks were mandatory, but they focused almost entirely on criminal records and fascist affiliations. The primary security concern in 1943 was Nazi sabotage and Axis espionage. Investigators screened for German sympathies, Italian connections, and Japanese ancestry. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor and during ongoing war with Germany, counterintelligence resources prioritized the immediate enemy. The Soviet Union, despite long-standing ideological hostility and deep suspicion within American military and intelligence circles, was a wartime ally against Nazi Germany. There was no systematic screening for Soviet ties. George Koval returned to the United States from the Soviet Union in 1940, well before American entry into the Second World War. He carried an American birth certificate, spoke fluent English without accent, and presented himself as a former Iowa resident who had spent several years in the Soviet Union with his family during the Depression. His background raised no alarm within a bureaucracy focused on identifying active threats from Axis powers. The possibility that the Soviet Union might be running intelligence operations inside the American nuclear weapons program was acknowledged in theory, but treated as a lower priority concern compared to German and Japanese espionage. Koval passed his background check without incident. Assigned to the Special Engineer Detachment, he was issued security clearance for movement across Manhattan Project facilities. The Special Engineer Detachment operated outside normal laboratory compartmentalization. Engineers were rotated across facilities to identify production bottlenecks, not to study weapon physics. This mobility created access patterns absent at Los Alamos. Special Engineer Detachment personnel were granted broad access because their function required it. Engineers needed to inspect equipment, monitor chemical processes, troubleshoot technical failures at multiple sites, and maintain production efficiency across geographically dispersed facilities. Compartmentalization applied rigorously to physicists working on weapon theory at Los Alamos. It applied far less rigorously to the men maintaining the machinery that made theory operational. The institutional logic was clear. A physicist who understood implosion dynamics, neutron multiplication, and critical mass calculations could, in principle, reconstruct an entire weapon design from theoretical principles. An engineer who understood chemical separation efficiency or electromagnetic isotope sorting could not. Engineering knowledge was procedural, fragmented, and limited to specific production tasks. Security doctrine treated it accordingly. Security clearance was granted by function, not by origin. The uniform became the clearance. By mid-1944, George Koval was stationed at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, site of the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant and the K-25 gaseous diffusion facility. His official role was technical inspection and process efficiency assessment. His responsibilities included monitoring equipment performance, documenting maintenance requirements, identifying production bottlenecks, and recommending procedural improvements to increase throughput and reduce contamination incidents. His actual role was identical. He simply reported to two chains of command. One chain terminated at Manhattan Engineer District Headquarters, the other terminated in Moscow. In April of 1944, the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant at Oak Ridge operated continuously, processing uranium hexafluoride through calutron separation units designed to enrich uranium-235 to weapons-grade concentration. The facility employed over 22,000 workers, most of whom had no understanding of the final product. Security was enforced through ignorance and compartmentalization. Workers operated equipment according to strict protocols, but were never informed of the larger purpose. The scale of Oak Ridge defied anything attempted in previous industrial history. Production records show the Y-12 plant alone consumed more electricity than many American cities. 9,000 calutron operators, mostly young women recruited from rural Tennessee, monitored electromagnetic separator panels 24 hours a day, adjusting dials and recording instrument readings without knowing that they were enriching uranium for an atomic bomb. The electromagnetic separation process was inefficient by later standards, requiring enormous energy input and producing relatively small quantities of enriched material, but in 1944, it represented the most reliable method available for producing weapons-grade uranium-235. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, located nearby, employed an entirely different enrichment method based on the differential diffusion rates of uranium, hexafluoride isotopes through porous barriers. The K-25 facility covered over 40 acres under a single roof, making it one of the largest buildings in the world at the time. Thousands of diffusion stages were arranged in cascades, each stage incrementally increasing the concentration of uranium-235. The process was continuous, automated to a degree unusual for the era, and required meticulous maintenance to prevent contamination that would compromise enrichment efficiency. George Koval was not a production line worker assigned to monitor a single instrument panel or maintain a single pump. As a Special Engineer Detachment officer, he conducted inspections and efficiency assessments across multiple processing stages. His responsibilities required him to move through restricted areas, observe isotope separation rates, examine material handling procedures, and document throughput optimization techniques. He observed how uranium hexafluoride was prepared for introduction into calutron units. He documented equipment failures and the maintenance procedures used to correct them. He reviewed chemical contamination incidents and the protocols developed to prevent recurrence. All of this information was classified, but none of it was theoretical. It was operational data. It described not what was theoretically possible, but what had actually been built and how it actually functioned under industrial operating conditions. Soviet archives, declassified after 1991, reference Oak Ridge throughput data with a level of specificity that could only have originated from direct facility access. The reports included electromagnetic separator efficiency rates measured in grams per day, uranium hexafluoride flow volumes through diffusion cascades, and enrichment timeline projections tied to specific production targets. These were not estimates derived from external observation or theoretical calculations based on published scientific literature. They were measurements taken from inside the production chain, recorded by someone who understood which numbers mattered and how they related to overall weapon production capacity. No counterintelligence monitoring of Special Engineer Detachment personnel occurred during this period. FBI resources at Oak Ridge focused on perimeter security, mail censorship, and surveillance of Los Alamos physicists suspected of communist sympathies. The assumption remained that scientists posed the primary threat, not engineers performing routine technical inspections. Process familiarity enabled reconstruction elsewhere. By late 1944, Soviet engineers working under the direction of Igor Kurchatov possessed detailed knowledge of American uranium enrichment methods. They understood the operational parameters of electromagnetic separation, the engineering challenges of gaseous diffusion, and the production rates achievable under continuous operation. They did not need to replicate the theoretical breakthroughs that led to the calutron design or independently derive the principles of isotope separation. They simply needed to know how the Americans had solved the practical problems of industrial-scale separation, what worked, what failed, what required modification, and what could be scaled to meet production quotas. The data left Oak Ridge intact, preserved on technical inspection reports and efficiency assessments that passed through military channels without raising suspicion. But it also left Oak Ridge in duplicate, reconstructed 7,000 miles away in facilities that would soon begin producing enriched uranium using methods refined through American trial and error. In August of 1944, George Koval received reassignment orders. His next posting was not Los Alamos, it was Dayton, Ohio. The Dayton project was a subsidiary program managed by the Monsanto Chemical Company under contract to the Manhattan Engineer District. Its purpose was classified even within the Manhattan Project itself, compartmentalized to an unusual degree. While thousands of Manhattan Project personnel understood that the program aimed to build an atomic bomb, only a small number understood the specific role of polonium-210 in weapon design. The facility handled the production, purification, and weaponization of polonium-210, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of 138 days. Polonium-210 was discovered by Marie Curie in 1898, named after her native Poland. In the decades since its discovery, polonium had been studied primarily as a scientific curiosity, a highly radioactive element with limited practical applications. Its selection for use in atomic weapons resulted from its unique nuclear properties. Polonium-210 emits alpha particles with high energy but without accompanying gamma radiation, making it ideal for neutron generation when paired with beryllium. When an alpha particle strikes a beryllium-9 nucleus, the reaction produces a carbon-12 nucleus and a free neutron. This property made polonium-beryllium combinations the standard neutron source in nuclear physics laboratories worldwide. But the Manhattan Project required something far more sophisticated than a laboratory neutron source. Polonium-210 served a singular function in the implosion-type plutonium bomb. It was the core element of the neutron initiator, a small spherical device placed at the center of the plutonium pit. During implosion, the initiator released a burst of neutrons at the precise moment of maximum compression, ensuring that the chain reaction began instantaneously rather than fizzling due to pre-detonation. The timing had to be perfect. Release neutrons too early, and the plutonium would begin fissioning before reaching maximum compression, producing a partial yield or complete failure. Release neutrons at exactly the right moment, and the weapon would achieve full designed efficiency. The technical term for this device was the Urchin, named for its spiked internal geometry. The initiator consisted of two concentric hemispheres. The inner hemisphere was made of beryllium. The outer hemisphere contained polonium-210, electroplated onto a gold substrate and sandwiched between thin beryllium layers. During implosion, the force of compression crushed the initiator, bringing the polonium and beryllium into intimate contact. The resulting alpha-neutron reaction released a burst of neutrons into the surrounding plutonium at the exact moment of maximum density, triggering the chain reaction. Without a functional initiator, the weapon might produce a partial yield or fail entirely. With a reliable initiator, detonation efficiency increased by orders of magnitude. Without a reliable neutron initiator, implosion symmetry was meaningless. Polonium production schedules dictated weapon readiness timelines, not theoretical design. The difference between a functional atomic bomb and a radioactive dispersal device often came down to a few grams of polonium-210 and the precision of its geometric configuration. Manufacturing challenges were significant and unlike anything attempted in industrial chemistry. Polonium-210 had to be produced in nuclear reactors by irradiating bismuth-209 targets with neutrons. The bismuth absorbed a neutron to become bismuth-210, which then underwent beta decay to become polonium-210. After irradiation, the bismuth targets were transported to Dayton, where they underwent chemical separation to extract polonium from the bismuth matrix. The chemical separation process required specialized equipment and extreme safety protocols. Polonium-210 is one of the most toxic substances known. A microgram absorbed into the human body delivers a lethal dose of radiation. Workers at Dayton operated behind lead shielding, using remote manipulators and specialized ventilation systems. Contamination incidents were frequent and dangerous. Polonium dust could become airborne. Equipment failures could expose workers to lethal radiation doses within seconds. Once separated and purified, the polonium had to be electroplated onto gold substrates with precise thickness and uniformity. The tolerances were measured in microns, too thick, and the alpha particles would not penetrate to reach the beryllium. Too thin, and the neutron flux would be insufficient to reliably initiate the chain reaction. The fabrication process required skills more commonly associated with jewelry manufacturing than industrial chemistry, combined with radiological safety procedures that did not exist in any other industrial context. The half-life constraint meant that production had to occur close to the weapon assembly timeline. Every 138 days, half of the polonium decayed into stable lead-206. Delays of even a few months could render stockpiled polonium insufficient for weapon use. This created a logistical challenge unique in weapon production. Uranium and plutonium could be stockpiled for years. Polonium could not. Every atomic bomb required fresh polonium production timed to coincide with weapon assembly. Soviet intelligence summaries later matched United States production methods with near-exact correspondence. Declassified GRU technical reports reference polonium handling procedures, initiator geometry specifications, and material purity tolerances that align directly with Dayton Project internal documentation. The level of detail extended to beryllium layer thickness measured in thousandths of an inch. Alpha particle emission rates calculated from specific activity measurements, neutron multiplication factors derived from experimental testing, and even the electroplating bath chemistry used to deposit polonium onto gold substrates. These specifications were not publicly available. They were not derivable from published scientific literature. They were manufacturing knowledge gained through trial and error, recorded in internal project documentation. These were not theoretical insights. They were manufacturing blueprints. The component was classified as minor within the Manhattan Project hierarchy. Physicists at Los Alamos focused on implosion symmetry and plutonium pit geometry, the central challenges of weapon design. Initiator production was delegated to a chemical facility in Ohio, supervised by engineers rather than weapon designers. Security at Dayton was serious but not comparable to Los Alamos. Workers underwent background checks, but the facility lacked the multiple layers of military security and counterintelligence surveillance that characterized Los Alamos. The assumption was that knowledge of initiator design, while classified, was not sufficient to reconstruct an entire weapon. Possession of polonium-210 did not grant the ability to build an atomic bomb. Possession of plutonium did. But the assumption missed the operational reality. Manufacturing an atomic bomb required solving dozens of interlocking technical problems. Plutonium pit design was one, initiator reliability was another. A weapon with a perfect plutonium pit but an unreliable initiator was not a functional bomb. It was a sophisticated radiological device capable of scattering plutonium across a wide area without achieving a nuclear detonation. A few grams of polonium determined detonation reliability, and George Koval had direct access to every stage of the process: production, purification, fabrication, and quality control testing. He understood the chemistry, the engineering tolerances, the safety protocols, and the manufacturing bottlenecks. He knew which procedures worked and which procedures had been abandoned after failure. He knew production timelines, yield rates, and contamination frequencies. All of this knowledge reached Moscow. In late 1944, technical reports compiled by the GRU began arriving at Soviet nuclear facilities under the direction of Igor Vasilievich Kurchatov. According to a GRU technical summary declassified decades later, these reports were categorized as manufacturing-level intelligence, distinct from the theoretical data provided by other sources embedded at Los Alamos. Kurchatov, born in 1893, trained as a physicist specializing in nuclear physics and dielectrics. In 1943, he was appointed scientific director of the Soviet atomic bomb program, responsible for coordinating research across multiple institutes, overseeing reactor construction, and translating theoretical knowledge into operational weapons. Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist working at Los Alamos, provided detailed theoretical information on implosion design, neutron behavior, and critical mass calculations. Theodore Hall, an American physicist also at Los Alamos, transmitted independent confirmation of implosion methodology and plutonium metallurgy data. David Greenglass provided mechanical drawings of initiator components, though his understanding of the underlying physics was limited. The distinction between theoretical and manufacturing intelligence mattered profoundly. Theoretical physics accelerated understanding. It allowed Soviet scientists to grasp the principles of nuclear fission, the requirements for critical mass, the advantages of implosion over gun-type assembly. Theoretical intelligence saved years of fundamental research, compressing the timeline from initial concept to practical weapon design. But manufacturing data accelerated production. It allowed Soviet engineers to bypass trial and error experimentation in chemical separation, metallurgical processing, and component fabrication. It provided solutions to problems that could not be solved through theory alone. what materials worked in practice, what procedures failed and why, what tolerances were actually achievable rather than theoretically ideal, what production rates could be sustained under continuous operation. Soviet engineers could bypass trial-and-error experimentation in polonium separation chemistry because they possessed American procedures developed through months of expensive and dangerous experimentation at Dayton. They possessed detailed knowledge of beryllium layer fabrication tolerances derived from American testing programs that cost millions of dollars and exposed dozens of workers to radiation hazards. They understood neutron flux requirements and initiator timing mechanisms based on American experimental data gathered under controlled conditions that the Soviet program could not yet replicate. The intelligence did not simply describe what the Americans had built. It described how they had solved the problems that arose during construction, which approaches had been attempted and abandoned, which materials had been tested and rejected, which procedures had been optimized through iterative refinement. Kurchatov later acknowledged that foreign intelligence significantly accelerated Soviet initiator development. In a 1946 memorandum to Lavrentiy Beria, head of the Soviet atomic project under Stalin, Kurchatov wrote that American intelligence had allowed Soviet engineers to avoid numerous blind alleys and costly mistakes. Archival records indicate that Soviet engineers replicated the American Urchin design with only minor modifications, avoiding years of experimental failure that had plagued early American efforts. The alignment with United States implosion methodology was not coincidental. Soviet engineers working at Laboratory No. 2, later renamed the Kurchatov Institute, possessed manufacturing specifications that matched American designs point by point. When Soviet metallurgists fabricated beryllium hemispheres for initiator construction, they used dimensional specifications identical to those developed at Dayton. When Soviet radiochemists separated polonium from irradiated bismuth targets, they employed chemical procedures parallel to American methods. When Soviet weapon designers calculated neutron flux requirements, their numbers aligned with American experimental results. Industrial data compressed development timelines by eliminating uncertainty. In weapon development, uncertainty translates directly into time. Each unknown parameter requires experimental investigation. Each experiment requires resources, personnel, and months or years of iterative testing. Intelligence that eliminates uncertainty eliminates time. The Soviet Union did not need to discover through independent experimentation that polonium-beryllium initiators required specific geometric configurations to produce reliable neutron flux. They knew. They knew because George Koval had transmitted the data and the data was operationally complete. Parity was engineered before it was tested, and the engineering occurred in parallel, separated by 7 time zones and absolute secrecy, using blueprints that originated inside an Ohio chemical plant where security was serious but insufficient, where engineers moved between processing areas with minimal oversight, and where a single technical officer with the right training and motivation could observe everything that mattered. In 1945, as the war in Europe concluded and preparations for atomic weapon deployment against Japan intensified, post-war security audits began within the Manhattan Project. A post-war audit noted the focus remained overwhelmingly on Los Alamos and the theoretical physics community. The concentration of scientific talent at Los Alamos, combined with the theoretical nature of their work, made them the obvious target for counterintelligence scrutiny. The Federal Bureau of Investigation opened investigations into several scientists suspected of communist sympathies or undisclosed foreign contacts. Surveillance expanded across multiple facilities. Mail was monitored through postal intercepts coordinated with military intelligence. Phone lines were tapped under wartime security regulations. Informants were recruited within the scientific workforce, often from among junior researchers or administrative staff with access to conversations and social interactions among senior physicists. The FBI's investigation intensified around scientists who had expressed leftist political views, participated in anti-fascist organizations during the 1930s, or maintained contact with individuals suspected of Communist Party membership. The Bureau compiled extensive files on physicists at Los Alamos, Berkeley, Chicago, and Columbia. Agents monitored their attendance at political meetings, their subscriptions to left-wing publications, and their associations with known communist organizers. No audits of Dayton or Oak Ridge Special Engineer Detachment personnel occurred during this period. The logic was institutional and deeply embedded in counterintelligence doctrine. Scientists possessed the knowledge necessary to reconstruct weapon theory from fundamental principles. An individual who understood neutron multiplication, critical mass calculations, implosion dynamics, and plutonium metallurgy could, in principle, provide sufficient information to allow another nation to develop atomic weapons independently. Engineers, by contrast, possessed only procedural understanding of isolated production tasks. A calutron operator understood how to maintain electromagnetic separators, but not why isotope separation mattered. A chemical engineer at Dayton understood polonium purification procedures, but not necessarily how polonium fit into overall weapon design. Counterintelligence resources were allocated accordingly. The FBI maintained permanent field offices at Los Alamos. Agents conducted regular interviews with scientific personnel. They reviewed travel records, monitored correspondence, and investigated any suspicious contacts or behavior. Los Alamos physicists operated under constant awareness that they were being watched. The FBI investigated the people who understood the equations. They did not investigate the people who understood the machinery. This distinction proved decisive. George Koval's technical knowledge was procedural rather than theoretical. He could not independently derive the physics of nuclear weapons, but he could describe in precise detail how polonium-210 was produced, purified, and fabricated into initiator components. He could specify production rates, chemical procedures, and engineering tolerances. He could identify manufacturing bottlenecks and the solutions American engineers had developed to overcome them. George Koval was demobilized without suspicion, commended for competent service, and released from active duty with an honorable discharge. His service record documented satisfactory performance, technical competence, and no security violations. His security clearance was not flagged for review. His name appeared on no watch lists maintained by the FBI, military intelligence, or any other counterintelligence agency. His service record contained no annotations indicating concern, no recommendations for additional investigation, no notes suggesting anything other than routine military service by a technically trained soldier. The threat had been anticipated in theory. Classified security memoranda from 1944 and 1945 acknowledged the possibility that enemy intelligence services might attempt to penetrate Manhattan Project facilities. Security protocols were written to address this threat. Background investigations, compartmentalization, document controls, and personnel monitoring all aimed to prevent espionage. It was missed in practice. The security system was designed to detect one type of threat and implemented in ways that failed to detect another. Counterintelligence focused on individuals who might transmit theoretical knowledge, not individuals who might transmit manufacturing knowledge. Security officers monitored physicists who understood why the bomb worked, not engineers who understood how it was built. And the breach left no trace in the surviving counterintelligence record. No classified documents were reported missing from Dayton. No security violations were documented at Oak Ridge. No suspicious contacts or behaviors were noted in Koval's personnel file. The intelligence flowed from American facilities to Moscow without triggering any of the safeguards designed to detect espionage. Between 1946 and 1948, George Koval quietly departed the United States and returned to the Soviet Union. Passenger manifests list his name among thousands of post-war emigrants and travelers. No watch list flags appeared. No surveillance was initiated. No investigative follow-up occurred. From the perspective of United States counterintelligence agencies, George Koval was a former Army corporal with a technical background, no longer relevant to national security. From the perspective of the GRU, Operation Delamar had closed successfully. The asset had been extracted without compromise. The intelligence had been transmitted in full. The operation remained undetected. United States agencies remained entirely unaware of the asset loss, and the result had not yet detonated. But the fuses were already in place. On August 29, 1949, at 0700 hours local time, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic weapon at the Semipalatinsk test site in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. The device, designated RDS-1, utilized an implosion design nearly identical to the American Fat Man bomb detonated over Nagasaki 4 years earlier. Yield calculations confirmed 22 kilotons. The initiator performed as designed. Plutonium compression achieved critical mass within the required microsecond window. Neutron flux triggered an instantaneous and sustained chain reaction. United States Air Force atmospheric sampling aircraft detected plutonium fission products within hours. Seismic data supported the analysis. The data was unambiguous. The Soviet Union possessed a functional atomic bomb. Strategic intelligence estimates were revised immediately. National Security Council memoranda drafted in the weeks following the test calculated that the Soviet nuclear program had advanced by at least 3 years relative to previous projections. 4 years disappeared overnight. The question asked in Washington was not whether Soviet scientists were capable of developing an atomic bomb. The question was how they had developed it so quickly. Initial assessments focused on espionage at Los Alamos. Investigations intensified around Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project and would later be arrested and convicted of passing theoretical weapon data to the Soviet Union. Fuchs provided valuable intelligence, but his information was primarily theoretical. The initiator data was not theoretical, it was industrial. And it came from Dayton, not Los Alamos. But no one was investigating Dayton. In 1949 and 1950, the United States Strategic Air Command entered a period of rapid expansion and doctrinal revision. SAC alert posture increased across all operational bomber wings. The B-36 Peacemaker fleet, designed as an intercontinental strategic bomber capable of reaching Soviet territory from American bases, was expanded ahead of schedule. Production contracts were accelerated, crew training pipelines were enlarged, forward operating bases were reinforced. Simultaneously, President Harry Truman authorized the acceleration of the hydrogen bomb program. What had been a theoretical research effort became a crash development priority. Funding constraints were lifted, personnel were reassigned, facilities were expanded. Nuclear stockpile projections doubled within 18 months. Deterrence doctrine was rewritten under urgency. The assumption of American nuclear monopoly had shaped post-war strategy, NATO planning, and diplomatic negotiations with the Soviet Union. That assumption no longer held. Parity required a fundamentally different strategic calculus. Earlier, parity reshaped deterrence planning at every level. If the Soviet Union possessed a functional atomic bomb in 1949 rather than 1953, then the window of American strategic advantage had closed 4 years ahead of schedule. That window had defined early Cold War planning. Its sudden closure forced a cascading series of revisions across bomber force structure, nuclear stockpile requirements, civil defense planning, and alliance commitments. The monopoly ended before doctrine adjusted, and the adjustment occurred in crisis mode. Throughout the 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency compiled internal damage assessments attempting to reconstruct the full scope of Soviet atomic espionage. Investigations focused on Los Alamos, the radiation laboratory at Berkeley, and the University of Chicago Metallurgical Laboratory. Klaus Fuchs was identified, arrested, and convicted in 1950. David Greenglass provided testimony leading to the arrest and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg in 1953. Theodore Hall was identified but never prosecuted due to evidentiary concerns. The focus remained on physicists and theoretical intelligence. No audits examined the Dayton project. No investigations targeted Special Engineer Detachment personnel. No counterintelligence resources were allocated to industrial radiochemistry facilities. George Koval remained unidentified. No prosecutions were linked to industrial espionage at Dayton or Oak Ridge. The intelligence failure was structural. American counterintelligence doctrine prioritized theoretical knowledge over procedural knowledge. The assumption was that weapon theory represented the primary vulnerability. If equations were protected, the weapon was protected. But industrial processes were never just support functions. They were the weapon. And the correct question was never asked. The question should have been, who understood how to make it work? Instead, the question remained, who understood why it worked? The breach at Dayton remained unexamined for decades, not because it was concealed, but because no one thought to look. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian Federation authorities began selective declassification of Cold War-era intelligence archives. GRU operational files were partially released, and among the disclosed materials were references to successful intelligence operations conducted during the 1940s. In 2007, the Russian Federation posthumously awarded George Koval the title Hero of the Russian Federation, one of the highest state honors. The citation explicitly referenced his role in securing atomic intelligence during the Second World War and contributing to Soviet nuclear parity. The announcement was public. There is no publicly documented United States government response. American intelligence agencies did not dispute the Russian Federation's claims. No press releases were issued, no official statements were made. The disclosure passed largely without public attention in the United States, mentioned briefly in specialized historical publications and intelligence journals, but absent from broader media coverage. Recognition arrived from only one side. For decades, George Koval had remained invisible in American accounts of atomic espionage. His name appeared in no congressional hearings, no FBI investigation summaries, no declassified damage assessments. While Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, and Theodore Hall became synonymous with Manhattan Project espionage, Koval remained absent from the historical record. His invisibility was structural, not intentional. American counterintelligence had been searching for physicists. Koval was an engineer. Nuclear parity became a permanent condition of the Cold War. The strategic balance that defined superpower relations from the 1950s through the 1990s originated not in the laboratories of Los Alamos, but in the industrial facilities that translated theory into operational weapons. Industrial access was identified retrospectively as a primary vulnerability in Manhattan Project's security architecture. The lesson was incorporated into subsequent compartmentalization models, including those applied to hydrogen bomb development, intercontinental ballistic missile programs, satellite reconnaissance systems, and later nuclear weapons programs in Britain, France, and China. Security doctrine was revised after 1949 to emphasize protection of manufacturing processes, not simply theoretical knowledge. Clearance procedures for technical personnel were expanded to include more thorough background investigations, periodic reinvestigations, and lifestyle monitoring. Counterintelligence resources were reallocated from exclusive focus on scientific personnel to include engineers, technicians, and industrial workers with access to sensitive production data. Facility access protocols were tightened. The casual movement between sites that characterized Special Engineer Detachment operations during the Manhattan Project was replaced with stricter compartmentalization. Engineers were assigned to specific facilities rather than granted broad access across multiple locations. Technical documentation was more carefully controlled, with distribution limited to personnel with specific operational need to know. Production data that had been treated as routine technical information during the Manhattan Project was reclassified as sensitive intelligence requiring special handling and storage. But the revision occurred after parity had been established. The impact of George Koval's intelligence contribution remains difficult to quantify with precision. Soviet nuclear development was supported by multiple intelligence sources, including Klaus Fuchs at Los Alamos, who provided critical theoretical data on implosion design, and Theodore Hall, who independently confirmed plutonium metallurgy procedures. But initiator intelligence was distinct. It addressed a manufacturing bottleneck that could not be solved through theory alone. Knowing that an initiator was necessary did not automatically reveal how to build one reliably. The engineering tolerances, chemical procedures, and fabrication techniques required years of development work unless that work had already been completed elsewhere and the results transmitted intact. Igor Kurchatov's acknowledgement that foreign intelligence accelerated Soviet initiator development is documented in declassified Soviet records from the immediate post-war period. The correspondence between American and Soviet polonium handling procedures is similarly documented through comparative analysis of technical specifications that became available after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The timeline compression is measurable. American intelligence projections from 1947 estimated Soviet atomic capability no earlier than 1952. The actual detonation occurred in 1949. The three-year acceleration had strategic consequences that shaped the entire Cold War. The result reshaped the Cold War in ways both obvious and subtle. Berlin, 1961, Cuba, 1962. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties negotiated throughout the 1970s. Mutual Assured Destruction Doctrine. All of these emerged within a framework of nuclear parity that originated earlier than American planners had anticipated. If Soviet atomic capability had materialized in 1953 rather than 1949, the structure of early Cold War crises would have differed fundamentally. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, occurred under conditions of established Soviet nuclear capability rather than American monopoly. The Taiwan Strait crisis of 1954 and 1955, the Hungarian uprising of 1956, and early NATO expansion all occurred in a strategic environment shaped by nuclear parity. Doctrine, deployments, and diplomatic calculations were all influenced by the assumption that Soviet nuclear capability existed and would exist indefinitely. By 1950, United States nuclear planning shifted from monopoly management to parity containment. This shift influenced early Strategic Air Command posture, hydrogen bomb prioritization, and the abandonment of assumptions underpinning early deterrence theory. The timeline compression forced strategic adjustments that reshaped American Cold War policy for decades. That assumption became valid in August of 1949, 3 to 4 years earlier than American strategic planning had projected. The atomic monopoly was never lost, it was never real. American strategic planning between 1945 and 1949 operated under a premise of exclusive nuclear capability. But that exclusivity was compromised before it was fully operationalized. The intelligence flow that undermined the monopoly began in 1944, while the Manhattan Project was still under construction. By the time the United States deployed atomic weapons against Japan in August of 1945, the data necessary to replicate those weapons was already in transit to Moscow. The monopoly existed only in the period between operational deployment and Soviet operational capability. That period lasted 4 years rather than the projected 7 to 10. The failure lay not in secrecy, but in assumptions. Security doctrine assumed that theoretical knowledge represented the decisive vulnerability. Industrial knowledge was treated as subordinate, procedural, and less strategically significant. The assumption was institutionally logical. Physicists understood the fundamental principles. Engineers understood only specific tasks within a larger system they did not fully comprehend. The assumption was also operationally incorrect. In practice, weapon development required both theoretical understanding and manufacturing capability. Possessing one without the other was insufficient. The Soviet Union acquired both simultaneously through multiple intelligence channels, but the manufacturing intelligence proved as decisive as the theoretical intelligence. The equations mattered, but the machinery mattered more. George Abramovich Koval understood that distinction. So did the GRU officers who trained him at the Mendeleev Institute, the intelligence analysts who processed his reports in Moscow, and the Soviet engineers at Laboratory No. 2 who used his data to compress their development timeline by years. American counterintelligence did not understand that distinction until decades after it ceased to matter. The story of George Koval is not the story of a singular intelligence failure. It is the story of a structural misalignment between threat perception and threat reality. It is a case study in the limits of compartmentalization, the vulnerabilities of industrial-scale secrecy, and the decisive importance of process knowledge in technological competition between nations. And it remains a reminder that the most dangerous intelligence breaches are often the ones that no one thinks to investigate, the vulnerabilities that exist not in dramatic betrayals or sensational espionage operations, but in the mundane daily work of technical professionals moving through facilities, observing processes, and understanding what matters. If you value factual Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War Files.